growth for the inquiry into the understanding and utilisation of benefits available under free trade agreements. In accordance with the committee's resolution on the 7th of September 2022, this hearing will be broadcasted on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I now welcome our first witnesses from the Productivity Commission. Welcome, and I welcome you to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear for before the committee?
Thanks, Chair. Dr. Alex Robson, Deputy Chair of the Productivity Commission.
Thank you. Anyone else accompanying you?
No, not this morning.
No. Thank you very much for that. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a short opening statement of no more than 5 minutes before we then proceed to a discussion and Q&A, and I hand over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I don't have an opening statement. All of our the items that we were commenting on were in our submission, so given the time constraints, I might hand back to you and we can get started on questions.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to highlight from your submission that really stands out that you'd like us all to, for the record, to hear today?
Yeah, I mean, a few of the key points, I guess. In Australia, over the last few decades, the developments in our trade policy have really been characterised by a reduction in tariffs, and now 90% of goods coming into Australia attract a zero tariff. But at the same time, behind the border measures have increased, and those two developments have been a similar around the world. And the Commission has done a lot of work on the benefits of reducing tariffs and preferential and free trade agreements, and so we're well placed to comment on those things and analyse them. Increasingly, preferential trade agreements for that reason. Most of the action now is in the sort of behind the border aspects of trade between nations, and those are increasingly complex and difficult to assess the benefits and costs of, whereas tariffs reductions are a bit more straightforward to consider. So those are the elements that I would highlight, I guess. I mean, the other element that I would like to highlight that we've done some work on recently in the Trade and Assistance Review is the nuisance costs of Australia's tariff system as a whole, and so that is the idea behind that, and the reality of it is that as a result of a range of preferential and free trade agreements now in Australia, most goods, as I said, coming in have a zero tariff applied to them, but that can be costly for businesses to actually seek out and secure those zero tariffs. And as a consequence, what has happened in Australia, and the Commission has done a number of pieces of work on this now, is that the tariff system in Australia doesn't collect very much revenue, but the costs of complying and seeking out the zero tariff rate is quite high. These are the so-called nuisance costs. And our conclusion and recommendation in the Advancing Prosperity report that we put out last year, a recommendation was for Australia to unilaterally abolish all tariffs for that reason as well as other reasons. And so we welcome the government's recent announcement and implementation of abolishing 457 so-called nuisance tariffs for exactly that reason. I think that represents around 14% of tariffs. So there is still more work to do in that regard, but it is a very welcome development. And this problem, I think, as Australia signs further preferential or free trade agreements will only get worse, because what happens is, the nuisance costs increase, the revenue goes down, and so I think we're beyond the point now where the best thing to do is just to unilaterally eliminate all tariffs in Australia, and that's been the Commission's position for a very long time. And I might stop there and hand back to you.
Excellent. I'll kick off with a couple of questions. Does the Productivity Commission play a role in promoting awareness, I suppose, within the Australian business community, public, etc., and an understanding of the benefits that we get out of free trade agreements and trade agreements, the benefits, not just the economic but social and economic benefits to Australia's FTAs?
Yeah, so we are the government's independent think tank and advisory body on economic, social, and environmental issues, and right from the beginning, going right back to our predecessor organisations, the Industry Assistance Commission, there has been a focus on trade within the Commission, as well as sort of pure productivity issues, and that grew out of, if you go back to 1973 and the establishment of the Industry Assistance Commission, there's a very good second reading speech by the Prime Minister of the time where he sets out the evolution of what was then the Tariff Board into the Industry Assistance Commission, and then that developed into the Industry Commission and the Productivity Commission. And since that time, we have had, a broad remit to, discuss and analyse and assess the benefits and costs of preferential and free trade agreements, as well as other trade developments. And that happens in either special studies or inquiries, but also we have the annual Trade and Assistance Review, which is now in its 50th year, which is a statutory requirement in our Act. And in that Trade and Assistance Review, we assess the industry assistance around Australia in the form of tariffs, but also budgetary spending and tax concessions. And then there's also an assessment and discussion of trade developments in Australia and around the world, and the changing nature of what's been going on in the WTO and other places. So, we do have a role there to play in not only sort of advising the government, who is our main and primary client, for want of a better word, on trade issues, but also the broader public as well.
Thanks. I've got one more question before I hand over to my colleagues. In your submission, you noted that the Productivity Commission is not aware of any studies about the populational businesses' understanding of the economic benefits that free trade agreements provide the nation with. Do you think it would be beneficial for the government perhaps to initiate or commission studies on this topic?
I think it would be, yeah. And I think, certainly, there is a broad view in Australia about the, the benefits and costs of trade with the rest of the world, and that, that view and counter views plays out in the public debate. But it might be worth having a sort of formal survey or study and sort of update it regularly around the public's and businesses' view of these kinds of things, and how that would be designed and who would do it are all questions for government. But I think it would be beneficial. It's always good to have more information rather than less when you're making government decisions, and so I think that would be a very good idea, depending on the design and then how it was used, of course.
Excellent, thank you. I'll now hand over to the Deputy Chair.
Thank you.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Steve. I think the next question is going to come from Senator Colbeck.
Okay, that's fine. Senator Colbeck.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions in relation to your comments around nuisance costs. Has the Productivity Commission done any analysis on the net benefits, or the net benefit of reducing those, or going to a net or a zero tariff regime, what would be the net productivity or net benefit to the economy of us doing that?
Yeah, so there's two broad ways you could think about this. One is just the pure sort of nuisance cost element relative to the revenue. And so in the Trade and Assistance Review this year, we estimate the total compliance costs of the tariff system as a whole between 1.3 billion and 4 billion, and that's relative to tariff revenue of 2 billion. So you can make that comparison and say, well, we'd lose revenue, but there'd be a gain to businesses and ultimately consumers to the extent that that would be passed on, but there'd be a benefit there to the economy as a whole of reducing those nuisance costs, which if you take the sort of midpoint of that range, the benefits of reducing the costs would outweigh the revenue loss. So that's one way to think about it. The other work that we have done is in a recent paper on the Asian trade integration work that we've put out earlier this year, where we looked at a scenario of Australia unilaterally eliminating all of its tariffs and on a range of indicators. And so I might direct you to that work, but just to give you a flavour of the benefits of Australia abolishing all its tariffs in terms of GDP, it's 0.07% increase in GDP. So that's a comparative static sort of result that just says, well, overnight we eliminated all tariffs, everything adjusted, and then we're in a world where there's no tariffs. There'd be an uptick in Australia's real GDP, and that would be that's a permanent increase in the level. And then there's been a range of other studies that we outline in our submission on the general benefits of reducing or eliminating tariffs. There was another piece of work done by the Centre for International Economics, I think roughly in 2016 and 17, where they looked at the benefits of progressively liberalising Australia's trade arrangements over the last couple of decades, and that's a very good study as well that I might direct you towards if you're interested in the impacts on real wages and households and overall living standards, jobs and so on of Australia progressively reducing barriers to trade over the last 20 or 30 years.
Okay, thank you. So in that sense, you see a productivity gain for the Australian economy if that was a path that was to be pursued?
Absolutely, yeah. That's been a consistent position of the Commission for many years. I mean, the counter argument is that, well, we should hold on to these tariffs to, negotiate them away in future agreements. There's a certain logic to that. However, the reality of it is now that, our tariff rates are so low across a broad range of goods that there's not that much to negotiate away, and the nuisance costs are now so high relative to the revenue that I think that the argument that we've put is a much better one relative to the one where you want to hold on to these things to be able to negotiate them away, because it just incurs so many costs every year.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of tariffs that sort of sit around the 5% mark.
That's right.
Does the work that you've done include what the real effect, or if there is an effect of those tariffs in a substantial sense in the market?
In what? Sorry, maybe clarify.
Well, I mean, a 5% tariff really, in a pricing sense, doesn't have a substantial impact on the pricing of a product in the market, particularly if the product is at a competitive price already.
Yeah.
It's effectively just adding 5% to overall cost of living, if you like, but not necessarily having a substantial impact on competitiveness in the market.
Yeah. I mean, the way we would think about it is the that to the extent that the tariff is passed on to consumers, then that's by getting rid of it, you could have a very modest impact on the cost of living. We haven't estimated that directly on consumer prices, but traditionally in Australia, the other impact has been that tariffs. One industry's sort of benefit of a tariff is a cost to another industry if it's a tariff on an intermediate good or whatever it might be. And so, at 5%, it's not really protecting any Australian industries to a great extent relative to what might have been the case before. If we think back to the big tariff reductions under Whitlam and Hawke, and then subsequently, and so that's another reason why we've advocated unilaterally abolishing tariffs, because there's just they're not protecting any industries as such, and they're just creating these nuisance costs, and those nuisance costs are actually they're passed on to other businesses and consumers as well. So
it becomes an exercise in the cost of the $2 billion, roughly $2 billion raised in tariffs versus the cost for government of collecting and then business of managing.
Yeah, exactly. And so the main cost there for business is under a preferential arrangement, these so-called rules of origin, where to attract the zero tariff as opposed to a 5% tariff, you have to demonstrate that the so-called economic nationality of the production process fits in with what's under the preferential trade agreement, and that could either be just doing the work to demonstrating it or actually changing your production process to fit in. And so that's where the main sort of nuisance cost or compliance cost comes from for business.
So you talked about the behind the border restrictions increasing and indicated that was a fairly common theme across a range of jurisdictions.
Yeah.
The rules of origin would be one of those? While you're thinking about that, how are those behind the border restrictions manifesting?
Yeah, I think that I would put the rules of origin just sort of intellectually into a different category. They're the sort of own category, and it's the the costs associated with complying with a preferential or free trade agreement. The behind the border measures that I'm referring to are things like subsidies to domestic industries that foreign competitors may not get. It might be tax concessions. It might be direct sort of grants from government. It might be concessional finance for domestic businesses. Rules of local content rules. So all of these things can address legitimate public policy concerns. The question, though, is then, to the extent that they selectively and discriminate between domestic and foreign firms, and the extent to which that then distorts Australia's trade with the rest of the world. And that is really the question. That's what the Trade and Assistance Review does every year, is to just set all of those things out, not make a judgment about whether they're good or bad, but just point to these potential risks. And as I said, and as you said, Senator, the other countries around the world are increasingly doing this as well, and that's been the case for many years.
Thanks, Senator. We might go to one of the government questions, if we could, Jerome.
Thank you. Thanks for your evidence today. We received a lot of written submissions about particularly small to medium businesses that just really have no visibility or knowledge of how to access these free trade agreements or what the benefits are. Can you outline what role the Productivity Commission plays in sort of raising awareness? And if you don't, that's fine. I'm just unaware of if you do or not. And then perhaps outline any other organisations that can help in trying to bridge this gap.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. So our role, I think, is more general and broad, in the policy sense. So our remit is we take a community-wide focus and look at policy through that lens. And so, most of our work on these kinds of issues is raising the awareness of the benefits and costs of different trade arrangements for the economy as a whole. Noting, though, that there would be, different distributional consequences, for different consumers and so on. We haven't, to my knowledge, looked, we don't sort of take well, for want of a better term, advocacy role or getting down into here's this free trade agreement. If you're a small business, you could take advantage of it in that sort of micro sense, and that is not our role. I think that would be elsewhere in government that would do that, but I would be talking off the top of my head if I had to talk about individual agencies that did that. But yeah, I can only talk about our role, and it's more of that general community-wide focus that we take on these issues.
Your submission mentioned the main barriers accessing the benefits of these PTAs are their complexity. How do you think government should overcome that?
Well, I think the first best would be to, in a tariff sense, just to unilaterally abolish tariffs. I think that's to the extent that you don't have, and I think we provide details on utilisation rates of different agreements. Some of them are quite high, others not so much. We haven't done a study as to exactly, why that is. Complexity is certainly, probably the main one. But the most straightforward and I think probably the most beneficial way of getting rid of that complexity in the tariff sense would be to just unilaterally abolish the tariffs. And then, but we haven't done then the work on, the sort of specific complexity involved with, utilisation of these agreements from a behind the border sense and the other arrangement. That's a much more complex task.
Okay, thanks, Chair. That's all the questions I have.
I'll ask Mr. Gillespie if he's got any questions.
Oh, okay. I was just interested in your thoughts on, I take on board all the summary points you made about the complexity cost for people and things like that, but just on a slightly different view with regard to free trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, the messages I get whenever I have conversations with business about exporting and the benefit we get out of free trade, most of them say, when are we going to start addressing all the tariff barriers that we put on ourselves before they leave the country? Because we're sort of like the Galapagos Island in economic evolution. We've gone down one path and the rest of the world only has 2 weeks holiday, doesn't have superannuation, doesn't have restrictive environmental costs, put tariffs on our own producers to check that importers' stuff is safe. Like, you could go on all day, but the cost base of Australia, the free trade agreement's great, but it's nothing compared to all the restrictions put on our producers on multiple levels. Have you got a comment on that?
The way we have thought about domestic policy issues is more in the domestic sense. We put out a big report on last year on our 5-year productivity review, where we made 71 policy recommendations across a number of areas, including some of the ones you mentioned there. But typically we haven't done a great deal of work on looking at Australia's superannuation system or these other kinds of costs relative to our major trading partners from a trade perspective. And so, I just couldn't comment on that. I mean, to the extent that it would lift Australia's productivity, sort of, notwithstanding any benefits or costs to trade, we would do, work commissioned by government or in the 5-year review on various policy issues such as education or data and digital or business dynamism or all of those sorts of things. And we've had a major inquiry on the superannuation system a number of years ago. But typically the focus of those inquiries or studies is on the benefits and costs to Australia just purely from the domestic sense, not looking at whether it affects our international competitiveness, unless it's a specific part of the terms of reference that we were asked to look at in that respect. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'll now ask Senator Polly.
No, it's fine, Chair, thanks.
All fine. Deputy Chair?
All good.
Sorry?
I'm fine, all good. I think we're conscious of time.
Any other questions? Being no other questions, we thank you very much for appearing before the committee today. If you've been asked to provide additional information, please send it to the Secretariat by the 27th of September, and you'll be sent a transcript of your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to make any corrections to the transcription errors if you feel there's any errors. Thank you for appearing before the committee today.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Now, I take it we've got Austrade either here or on the line. Yes, excellent. I see Mrs. Hamilton on the screen. So good morning, Mrs. Hamilton. I now welcome Austrade to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you, Chair. I'm Jay Meek. I'm General Manager for Trade at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a short opening statement of no more than 5 minutes before we proceed to a discussion and a Q&A. Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So we thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the inquiry into understanding and utilisation of the benefits of free trade agreements. Let me first talk very briefly about the role of Austrade as an agency before going into our contribution of FTAs. Austrade is responsible for delivering quality trade and investment services to business, as well as developing and implementing tourism policy. Our priorities deriving from key government priorities include economic security, net zero, trade diversification, First Nations, visitor economy and trade modernisation. Through our work, Austrade has a strong understanding and connection with Australian business, peak industry bodies, business chambers and other organisations across the trade sector, including through our international network. This understanding and connection allows Austrade to play a significant role in promoting an understanding of FTAs to Australian businesses. FTAs help maximise opportunities for Australian businesses and help exporters grow and diversify their markets and support for Australian prosperity and resilience. Austrade actively leverages its network and platforms to help educate Australian businesses on FTA settings and encourages the utilisation of FTA terms. We're coordinating across government and in consultation with business the delivery of incremental reforms to simplify the cross-border trade process through easier digital systems and simpler rules. And we actively promote FTAs. We undertake targeted outreach activities, working with partners to deliver sector and market-specific activities on FTAs. And we also support business with large-scale events internationally that generate opportunities to use FTAs. Recently, we are maintaining and rapidly developing a suite of digital services and tools like the Go Global Toolkit that give fast and easy access to information on FTAs and their benefits. And the online delivery of this method of access allows a wide audience to reach accessibility to particularly SME businesses and those in remote and regional Australia, and particularly those that are starting to think about exporting. We use media and digital channels to promote positive benefits of FTAs, particularly by highlighting the practical success stories of other exporters. And it's that type of promotion that amplifies the message that helps other businesses think about, well, whether they should be utilising that FTA as they start to export. Whilst our promotional efforts cover all arrangements, we've been particularly focused on new arrangements with the Australia-United Kingdom Free Trade Agreement and the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement, more commonly known as ECTA. And what we've seen is that these efforts have contributed to the utilisation of FTAs, that there's been a 300% increase in trade clients from trade outcomes from our clients in the UK, and a 120% increase in trade outcomes from our clients in India in 12 months following the FTA entry into force, when compared to the preceding 12 months. That'll give you a brief snapshot of the things that we do, and we will open up for questions. We're welcome to take questions.
Thank you very much. I'll kick off with a couple of questions, if that's okay. What we want to look at this, within this inquiry is smaller businesses that are already doing free trade. That are already doing trade with companies overseas that perhaps we may have a trade agreement or may not, and how we can assist these smaller companies to do even bigger and better things, because they've achieved quite a bit on their own and through their own knowledge and connections, but also how we can learn from them, some of the things that they've been doing for years. We're currently negotiating, for example, the EU Free Trade Agreement. Now, I raise this because I'd like to know how Austrade engages with, for example, the diaspora community or smaller multicultural business communities that have been doing business. And I'll give you two examples within my own electorate. One is a small company that's actually exporting olive oil to Greece and has been doing so in years where they have shortcomings over there for a number of years, and exporting a whole range of goods all through Europe. The other one is San Remo, who's exporting pasta to Italy. When I speak to both of these companies, they tell me they have very little engagement. And I spoke to them during the when talks were continuing with our EU counterpart for a free trade agreement, and asked them if anyone had ever spoken to them about some of the intricate things that they do that has benefited their businesses over the years. So I was just wondering what sort of with those communities or those smaller businesses in Australia, does Austrade actually engage with them, and in what way do you engage with them to promote the uptake of the benefits through free trade agreements, or even for organisations like Austrade and others who are negotiating to learn from them, because obviously these businesses have been very successful, have their contacts, have been trading for many, many years without a free trade agreement. Do we ever take any advice from those people, or do we speak to them, or how does that work?
Yeah, thanks, Chair, for the question. Can I maybe suggest that we invite Ms Hamilton to the conversation first about the awareness of how we do FTAs, and then I'll bring it back to the practical conversations that we do.
Thank you.
Good morning, Jessica Hamilton. I'm the General Manager of Simplified Trade Communication and Marketing for Austrade. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you the work that we do. As you say, Chair, it really starts with awareness, and there's a number of things that we do in outreach through our digital channels, whether that be our website, social media, and our email channel. We have over 115,000 people that have opted in to receive news and updates from Austrade on an ongoing basis, and we're always talking about the opportunities that are available to them through FTAs and other mechanisms, and the opportunities and the benefits of international business. But it's really the stories that we find. We can talk in all the technical terms that we like about tariffs or Incoterms and other bits and pieces, but ultimately what we have found that cuts through is businesses seeing themselves in other businesses that have succeeded and grown overseas and how that's impacted their businesses and their communities. And we really focus on telling the stories of those businesses. A couple of practical examples of the way that we've done that most recently, and in fact that we've been doing it, and this is our 62nd year, is the Australian Export Awards. It's one of Australia's longest running business awards programs, and it recognises the Australian companies that are succeeding overseas. And we actually attract a very diverse audience, and we work with the states and territories in partnership with them to celebrate and recognise all of the businesses in every single state and territory in the country, and then recognise those that succeed on a national level at the end of the year in November as well. Now, over half of the businesses that participate in that program are actually very small or even micro businesses. We purposefully target our outreach through partnering with organisations like ACCI to find those smaller businesses that people don't know about, and then we tell their stories to inspire others. In terms of the awareness, we also do things like partner with media outlets like the ABC, and on Landline we ran a 5-part series. And what we did was cover the opportunities for Australia's agricultural exporters under ECTA, and included the benefits for Australia's wine, lamb, wool, almond and avocado industries, and told those stories. So we're always out there actively engaging in different ways, as Mr. Meek mentioned, when there's moments when things come in force, when there's anniversaries of free trade agreements, whether that's 1 year, 5 year, 10 years even. So it's always about a call to action though. We can create awareness and people feel good about these opportunities and they want to pursue those. And then it's about the servicing and connecting them into the support that's available to them across government. And I might pass to Mr. Meek, who can talk about we have a Go Global toolkit, which is available 24/7 to businesses, as well as networks like TradeStart, etc. So, Mr. Meek.
Yeah, thanks, Ms Hamilton. And maybe to build out your answer on the practical side of what we do is that we have a team of people in Australia that are employed by us that work with exporters. We also partner with states and territories and chambers of commerce and have TradeStart advisors that also engage with clients. And they do two things: that they help those businesses to obviously go overseas, but we also use that same network to help bring together intelligence to inform for DFAT as they negotiate on free trade agreements. But as Ms Hamilton suggested, the best thing that we've seen over the years is the storytelling of the people that have used it. And as someone that lives in your electorate, actually, we've worked with a number of businesses. And, the example you gave, San Remo, we've worked with extensively to help them go globally as a business and help them navigate some of those things over the years around that. It's also probably worth drawing back a little bit in history, is that previously Austrade was funded to run extensive FTA awareness seminars, and that was done about 6 years ago, and we've actually still see some of the benefit of that today. That people actually are aware of what an FTA is, and that leads to what utilisation rates are. But obviously that's a pipeline with more businesses coming through. And what we are finding is that the mode of how we service businesses isn't actually always about coming in a room anymore. Many of them want it on their phone when they're at where they can actually access it. And that's where we use the Go Global toolkit. It's not a website, it's actually a digital service offering. And we're putting a lot more content on that and building that to make sure that people can understand the practical aspects of an FTA. I hope that answers your question.
One more question before I hand over to my colleagues. Do you think there's more opportunity to engage with the diaspora community to use the people-to-people contacts that they have to benefit and to promote the FTAs or the negotiation of FTAs?
So it's a really good question. So currently we're doing, I'm responsible for mapping a diaspora project on Southeast Asia. There's about 1 million diaspora here in Australia that have origins obviously in Southeast Asia, and we're looking at how we activate that community and listen to them and guide other businesses, and that's a key piece we do. I would say through the years of engagement we've had with many businesses and helping them go overseas, a lot of them are actually from the diaspora. So whether it's Vietnamese fruit and veg marketers or flour flower businesses that are doing work back into Vietnam, that we're engaging with them on that front. So there's more to be done on diaspora, and I think that's certainly something we're seeing through the 24 strategy produced by Nicholas Moore for government on Southeast Asia, and activating that community to help business go forward. Okay.
Is there specifically in Austrade an area that concentrates with the diaspora community, or do you have a special section?
So no, it's embedded into the trade piece, and actually the accountability for mapping diaspora in Southeast Asia is something new for us, but it's something I'm very keen to see about the implementation, not just mapping it, but activating that community. So, whether we've got a deep India community, learning from them about how to do business back and teaching others, and we'll bring those people, that diaspora, into forums to talk to SMEs. We'll shoot vision and we'll use our digital tools to be able to promote that out, that help guide people on how you do that business. Your example of olive oil to Greece. Tell the story.
That exact one, we produce a lot of olive oil here in South Australia, and I was just wondering, what was fed back to me was that, and they sell olive oil in the liquid form in tonnes in Europe, not in litres. And I was told by Omega Foods that if we had another 1,000 tonnes, I would have been able to sell it. Which got me to think, what about all the other olive oil producers? Were they aware of it? Was there someone there to promote it this year when there was a shortage in Europe, Southern Europe, of olive oil? So there would have been some opportunities there for many others. I mean, it's just a magnificent story when you think about it, and same with the San Remo one. Look, I'll hand over to the Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Steve. My quick question is the secondary barrier to entry for trade that sit behind the free trade agreements in the biosecurity space. I understand our banana guys, whilst we'll have free trade agreements, the biosecurity restrictions will be around preservation of their crops and the potential for their entire industry to be wiped out if bananas come in and they've got insects on them. And when other trading nations see that level of complexity around that entry, to be a barrier to trade entry, I can understand why they load up on us, but how much of an opportunity do we miss through biosecurity?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that we're the best agency placed to answer it, because this really is actually a question for DAF.
Copy.
On
Don't
what
worry about
that
it. Then
looks.
I think I got DAF next, so thank you. I'll go to Gillespie.
Yeah, thanks. Looking at the statistics you put in your submission, the free trade or preferential trade agreements obviously deliver huge benefits when it's it's a grown product. Food and fibre, just bulk, hasn't been through a factory, apart from abattoirs and things like that. Free trades work, but for our industrial production or anything that we actually manufacture, do these free trade things make any difference? Because, as I asked the previous presenter, most of our tariffs seem to be self-induced on our manufacturing sector because the world's so competitive, and we have, just peculiar to every other country that I can think of, lots of conditions, industrial conditions and other reimbursement conditions that are unique. And I just seek your opinion on whether they make any difference at all to that sector of the Australian economy.
So I suppose it really comes down to, and possibly this is for your 12 o'clock session with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, is as they negotiate free trade agreements, they obviously bring certain things to the table as part of that. And I think that's really something that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade needs to answer. I can give you anecdotal information that we have from business, where we're very practical organisations that help that. And the UK one's an example where, yes, we see some of those agri-commodities benefiting, but we're also seeing things like quantum computing and other things benefiting from those free trade agreements. So I can't specifically talk about manufacturing, as you said. I think that's possibly the DFAT conversation for you. But what I do know is that there are, depending on a bilateral or multilateral agreement, those benefits is actually about getting the awareness there. And you will see a lot of feature in agriculture, yes. But, for example, in the Australia-UK Free Agreement, we're working very closely with the fintech industry, the next generation of business coming through, and how they can actually, capitalise on what that looks like. Okay. So sorry if I can't answer your question in detail. Okay.
Thank you. Over to Senator Polly.
Yes, I was wondering if you could just talk us through when there's a free trade agreement set up with a country, do you actually go out and try and target businesses to make sure they're aware? What sort of assistance do you give them?
Yeah, so for, the first process is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade negotiate a free trade agreement, and once it's into entry, that we start to step into that space, and we, as Ms Hamilton highlighted, we do quite a bit of an awareness, and maybe a good example is the ECTA agreement with India, where we knew what provisions were in that free trade agreement, and we started building awareness campaigns and promotion material for SME businesses and running sessions with them about what those benefits look like. And that involved a roadshow in Australia, right across, bringing business together to hear about it. There were webinars that they could join, from their phone, where they could hear what those opportunities. And we then take it a step further, where we go in market and take delegations. So, for example, the Australian wine industry, which was in a fairly distressed state, that we held a major wine event called Pro Wine in India, where we took a cohort of Australian wineries over into India who have not gone to that market before to understand what the opportunity was and actually how the FTA could benefit them so they could start entering into that marketplace. So that's the type of practical stuff that we do every day. And then we have people that essentially key account manage businesses, exporters that are growing, and that's a standard part of their, I suppose, engagement with them. What are you looking to do? Have you considered the free trade agreements? Does that answer your question?
Yes, that is really helpful. But in terms of where we do have free trade agreements, there's some smaller companies in my state where I live who have really struggled since COVID in terms of their export market. What sort of outreach do you give to those people who are already exporting but perhaps haven't tapped into the free trade agreements, or just in terms of assisting them with their export markets?
Yeah, so in Tasmania, if I'm correct,
yes.
So we actually have a partnership arrangement with the Chamber of Commerce there. We have 2 dedicated Trade Start people that work extensively with exporters in that space. We have 1 employee down there, so a total of 3 those individuals are very well known in the export community that actually work with a lot of those exporters on what those opportunities are and how they can actually leverage them. We also obviously have a network around the world where we run digital sessions and we bring our people in. We have people from our regions across the world in currently this week that are running seminars where those businesses can come to. So in reality, there are 57,000 exporters, and we're not resourced enough to have people on the ground that can work one-on-one with all of them. That's part of the reason why Ms Hamilton highlighted that we're using media and digital tools to widen the reach. Historically, our agency has probably serviced about 6,000 businesses in a year, but what we're seeing is when we use tools like the Go Global Toolkit, since that's been operational, nearly 500,000 other users have come on board to get that information. So again, I don't know whether that addresses the question, but there is a lot of information out there that's quite practically put about what it takes. And I think, the example of Landline, so for those in the agri-industry, it's a really good sort of, promotional mechanism where they can see others of what they're doing, and we bring those people into some of those sessions that we run.
So the companies and the data that you collect around the free trade agreement, say with India, do you share that data with that country? Is there, dialogue between the data that you collect about Australian businesses to the Indian government?
That's probably a question for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and for possibly Border Force about what's actually shared. Essentially, the data that we capture is who's exporting and who we're helping into those markets. And as an agency, our performance measure are the number of our trade outcomes, in other words, commercial deals, and the value of those. We don't necessarily share that with the Indian government. That's commercial in confidence. And I'm not sure every Australian business will want us to share that type of detail. But what we do work with the Indian government on is the key areas of where things are going well. And the example of it in India, avocados is a prime example where they couldn't go into the marketplace, and now you'll find avocados day in, day out in India because of an FTA. And the industry association, the key exporters and the suppliers were all part of being briefed about the benefit of that.
So how do you identify the businesses that you would consider targeting with a new free trade agreement? What sort of information, where do you gather that from?
So we have access to data sets, which includes obviously the custom export data about businesses that are exporting already. But because of our partnership arrangements through what's called Trade Start with states and territories, that we work together on which of those businesses are the most appropriate to invite into that space. And then we use, which Ms Hamilton can talk about better than I can, is broad marketing mechanisms to get them to come and join. We don't know every business out there. That's not, I suppose, in the remit of Austrade, but we certainly do know all of the key exporters for merchandise, because there's hard data. Services industry, it's slightly more complex because there isn't data.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll now ask Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. Just going back to previous witness in the Productivity Commission, they talked about some of the costs in accessing zero tariff regimes. Does any of the work that you do provide assistance to business in achieving that?
So I suppose what we, maybe using the UK as an example, we practically work them through what's available. And it's probably worth highlighting that to utilise an FTA typically takes both sides to be aware. And so, maybe just to put on the table that we do a lot of promotion in market in the UK to bring people together to have a conversation. I wouldn't say that we necessarily go to the depths of the cost, but the broader probably proposition is that exporting takes time and money and resources. It's something that doesn't happen overnight typically. There's always the outlier. And where we make sure that we work with those exporters, particularly the new ones, to understand exporting in its own right. And even with an FTA, they're going to have to commit time and money to be able to help execute that off. I don't have the specifics in terms of an individual FTA, though, those costs are.
So it's more about making sure that they fully understand all of the things that they're going to have to manage and deal with, and give them some insights into the process of making sure they've got all those things covered off.
That's right.
As a part of their work in accessing a new market.
Yeah, and in some ways, and you shouldn't necessarily generalise, but FTAs sometimes are about compliance and understanding that compliance process, and there is a cost with that. But that's essentially been the process of exporting, and possibly some of the work that Ms Hamilton's doing on simplified trade is trying to streamline that process to make it easier and more cost efficient for business, which Ms Hamilton can talk to.
Do you have some comment on that, Ms Hamilton?
Yes, thank you. You may be aware that there's over 200 cross-border trade regulations, 145 ICT systems and 32 Australian government agencies that manage our border and everything that goes around protecting it. And
you make it sound so simple.
I know. And we really, Austrade is playing a key role working across government to deliver a series of iterative reforms and digital investments to create a simpler, more effective, inclusive and sustainable cross-border trade environment. This is an ongoing process. There is a lot of hard work that's happening across government today. The Go Global Toolkit that we talked about earlier is actually an example of that, of simplifying that environment to help businesses understand it. DAF's doing a lot of work to support taking farmers to market and removing manual processes for agricultural exporters. And they're also through a program called Simplified Targeting and Enhanced Processing Systems. They're digitising biosecurity clearance systems for cargo, which has delivered e-certificates for brokers, allowing them to view certificates electronically. There's a lot of paper, there's a lot of process that sits around trade. So we're working across government to help identify what are the practical things that we can do to help make it simpler for businesses and to understand what the barriers are and to prioritise that work across government. And that's a key role that Austrade's playing now with the Simplified Trade System Unit becoming part of the agency from the 1st of July.
Is some of that dependent on the partnering jurisdiction and the requirements of that jurisdiction in relation to things like digitised certificates? So some countries very much are still demanding to see a piece of paper. So
that's correct.
To what extent is that dependent on the partnering jurisdiction, and is there any specific work that you are doing, or is it other agencies that are dealing with that in trying to convince them that efficiencies can be gained, productivity can be gained by changing this or modernising the systems?
You're absolutely right, Senator. It's trade. It has two partners in it, and we have to align. We are working closely with the Attorney General's Department, and that's about aligning our legislation to the UN model law on electronic transferable records, or we call it the model law, and this is around paperless trade. And that is about, helping to remove some of those paper. And we make these agreements and commitments in bilateral and multilateral agreements with several of our trading partners, but there isn't one way in which everyone around the world has got a single model through which we do this. It's an ongoing process, and not every country is at the same point in time. So it is absolutely a consultation, a prioritisation process that we're working through with our partner and trialling different things with different nations as well.
So you talk about the UN digitisation, acceptance of digitisation or digital records model. What's the level of uptake of that?
I'd have to take that on notice, Senator, but we can absolutely provide that detail to you.
I just want to go back to the discussion around sort of the growth sectors in relation to the application of free trade agreements and what is where. I suspect that would again be jurisdiction dependent. You talk about fintech for the UK free trade agreement, whereas the potential growth areas would be very different, for example, for India.
Correct.
So it's market-based in relation to where the opportunity lies, and that would rely very much on your network of officers in the various jurisdictions being aware of what's going on in those places and then being able to provide matching back to
Correct.
businesses here in Australia.
Yeah, so I think your description's right. Obviously, each agreement has its own areas of focus, and obviously we try to match that with what we want to include in that. That's part of the negotiation that Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade lead on. But we obviously work with them once that's in force and then start to reach out and target. And so we use, coming back to the previous question, data sets to work out the target audience of who we can talk to come into that.
In terms of the questions the Chair asked before about supporting small business in particular and getting into the market, is there any assistance or support as part of that process with respect to accessing these modernised toolkit?
The Go Global Toolkit is actually a free service that we're offering to SMEs, and so they can access it at any time, 24/7 hours a day, in that space. And it's one of the active steps that Austrade has been funded for 2 years, that we see very strong growth in digital servicing, and some of the research that we've done on that, it's not actually always just SMEs. Even some of our larger entities are drawing on our digital services to help them.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'll now ask Mr. Lexley.
Thank you. Look, thanks for your evidence today and just for preparing out this inquiry. What you're doing to engage with small businesses and new businesses, it sounds pretty good. But in a lot of the evidence we've received from some of those diaspora business chambers, like, it doesn't seem to, it's not cutting through to them.
Yep.
How do you propose to address that?
So if I could give you an example on Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So as part of the strategy to strengthen two-way trade between Australia and Southeast Asian countries, is that we've got an extensive outreach program starting with those chambers of commerce to leverage what they're doing with their membership in particular. And there's obviously, a strong diaspora component to that. I would say, though, that there is another cohort of business that may not be members of those chambers. And one of the reasons why we're trying to strengthen that relationship is to drive more value into them, those chambers, so that they can actually get more members to come in and hear that information. So, as I sort of described, is that our reach historically has been about 6,000 businesses exporting business out of 57,000. That's rapidly evolving with digital, but it's also going to evolve in a different way as we start to do the collaboration with chambers of commerce and working more hand in hand with them. A really practical example is that we're doing work on the Philippines. There'll be sessions rolling from Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne next week, where hand in hand Austrade is doing that with the Philippine Chamber of Commerce and the chamber in market, to talk them through what the opportunities are and the practicalities of what can actually happen there.
So you reach out to them directly? Is that, does Austrade have a team that finds all these chambers?
All the chambers are quite well known. We've mapped them all.
Yeah, good.
And it's probably worth noting that they're not all equal. They're not all equal in terms of size, scale and capability.
Yep.
And basically that's because of their membership, and those chambers are primarily driven or funded by members.
Yep.
And if we can put more value into those by working with them, that they become more sustainable and can be serviced. It is worth noting the states and territories also support in this space. So if you go to Melbourne, Victoria, they have an entity known as Chamber House that is actually the home of quite a number of chambers of commerce, where they get accommodation and meeting facility rooms, etc.
And you mentioned you've got a Southeast Asian project at the moment.
Correct.
How do you decide which countries you're focusing on?
So the Prime Minister appointed a Special Envoy, Nicholas Moore, to lead that work. He's a former Group CEO of Macquarie Bank. He's developed a strategy that government is in the process of implementing that identifies 10 countries and 10 industry sectors, and that's how we're framing our work to go execute that work.
Have you done this type of targeted campaign before?
Probably not in recent times to the extent that we're doing, but that's but we have consistently engaged with quite a few chambers over the years as an agency. We work very closely with a number of them from various regions around it, but this is in a much more focused and sustained way as we look at two-way trade, but also outward investment from Australia into Southeast Asia will be part of that work. And Ms Hamilton can talk about the marketing side of that, which is quite extensive as well, that will support what you're asking.
Do you do marketing in languages other than English?
Ms Hamilton, do you want to?
Here in Australia, we only have to date been advertising and promoting in English. We do a lot of translations when we're promoting Australia internationally, which is a core part of also our business as usual. So, for example, for international students, we run the Study Australia website, which is translated into 8 different languages. So, but here for our domestic engagement to date, we haven't offered translated content at this point in time, but it is something that we want to make sure that our content is accessible and usable and our digital services are inclusive. And as we talk about our engagement with the Australian business community to take advantage of the trade and investment opportunities that are available across Southeast Asia, it's definitely something that we're working with and on at the moment and will be considering.
So you haven't advertised in non-English language media, you haven't advertised in non-English language social media or anything like that before?
In Australia?
Yeah,
no,
in Australia.
Overseas, extensively, yeah.
Okay. I'd encourage you to address that. A lot of communities read and get their content from non-English language platforms, so it's probably maybe a reason why we're getting a lot of feedback from these business chambers like this. Look, it's a whole of government problem, and I'd really encourage you. Like, there's non-English language, traditional media, and online media, as well as like alternative platforms. So that's interesting. Sorry, just going through. Could you provide us with some of the details of that when you're going into the Philippines chambers in the capital cities? Is that something you could do, or is that's available online?
So I think we could probably provide you on notice. Like, we've got a forward program of missions that we've been executing, and some of the activities that we're doing with chambers here and peak industry bodies.
Yep. And any detail on if it's public, the strategy from the special envoy, if that's
that's completely public.
Okay, great. Yeah. If you could provide that, that'd be fantastic. Okay. Look, that's it for now, Chair. I might pop back if something pops to mind, but thanks for your evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Gillespie. Time's running very short, but I do have one more question from Mr. Gillespie, if you can make it.
Yeah. Mr. Meek, that list of 10 markets that we need to focus on, is that a public document yet?
Yes, it is. So
it's on Austrade's site?
So on the DFAT's website, it's on our website. It's quite publicly available. We can give you a copy of that strategy.
What's the name? What's it called?
So Southeast Asia Strategy of 2040.
Yeah.
So I can provide that to you. We'll get that through.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, and that brings us to the end of our session. I'd like to thank Austrade for appearing before us today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, I think there was a couple of things Ms Hamilton was asked earlier, please send it to the Secretariat by the Friday the 27th of September 2024 if possible, or around that date. And you'll also be sent a transcript of everything said today with your evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to make any corrections if you feel that there are corrections needed. And finally, thank you very much for appearing before the court, before the committee.
Than's very much.
Thank you. We now call the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, our next witnesses for the table. Right. Good morning and welcome. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appeared before the committee?
Thank you. Good morning, Chair. My name's Jo Granger. I'm the Acting First Assistant Secretary of the Trade and International Division at the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
Thank you.
And good morning. I'm Brett Hughes. I'm an Acting Assistant Secretary in the Trade and International Division of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry.
Thank you and good morning to both of you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'll now invite you to make a short opening statement of no more than 5 minutes before we proceed to a Q&A and a discussion. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, and we're very pleased to come and join the committee. The Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry works to unlock trade opportunities so that stakeholders can utilise the commercial benefits arising from free trade agreements. As outlined in our submission to the committee, the department plays a key role in Australia's FTA negotiation process. This includes advocating for the outcomes that benefit Australia's agriculture sector, such as improving market access, that's lowering tariffs or establishing a quota, and not compromising the integrity of Australia's biosecurity system, as well as ensuring that relevant industry bodies and interest groups have the opportunities to contribute to the negotiations and are kept abreast of relevant developments in negotiations. Complementing the FTA process, DAF, as the competent authority for agriculture and agri-food trade, negotiates the technical market access arrangements for the new market access that's actually gained through an FTA. This is a critical technical role that DAF delivers to ensure that the FTA trade opportunity can be utilised by industry. And of course, FTAs are so important for the agriculture sector. The maintenance of international trade markets, negotiation of new FTAs, and expansion of technical market access are critical in helping our agriculture sector meet its goal of being a $100 billion industry by 2030. The Australian agriculture, fish and forestry sectors are heavily reliant on trade, with more than 70% of our produce exported to over 100 markets around the world. So in 2023-2024, Australian agriculture exports were worth nearly $73 billion. FTAs, therefore, are crucial in providing commercial opportunities and benefit to the sector, from primary producers through to food processors and exporters. They're also a significant contributor to regional communities by creating employment opportunities and generating economic activity. Australian agriculture relies on predictable and expanding export markets, coupled with the preferential tariff and quota access established through trade agreements, and then the technical market access and the rules governing trade between the parties. So the negotiation of FTAs provides the ag sector with diversified trade opportunities, allowing our exporters to send product to market where the market demand is greatest and, of course, where the returns are highest on the day. Australia's FTA now cover more than 80% of Australia's agricultural exports, and they have provided new and commercially meaningful market access for our agriculture and food sectors, and they've obviously supported new market diversification opportunities. So as our submission notes, the economic benefits of FTAs are significant. For example, since the Australia-India Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement entered into force on the 29th of December 2022, the agreement has supported tangible commercial outcomes for exporters, including for almonds, cotton, sheep meat, citrus, and wood and paper exports. Under the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which started in 2020, agriculture exports have more than doubled, driven by nearly a 5-fold increase in wheat exports and large increases in beef and veal and horticulture exports to that market. And then finally, the Australia-UK FTA, which entered into force on the 31st of May 2023, has already seen significant increases in beef exports to the UK. They increased 414%, of course from a low base. We're up from $11.2 million to $57.4 million over 11 months. And our sheep meat and goat exports, which increased to $111 million in the same period. So once those tariff outcomes are established, however, there's no guarantee that Australian businesses and workers can immediately export their produce to trading partners. Businesses may still be faced with the technical market access restrictions, difficulties adhering to the regulatory practices of our trading partners, and that's particularly on the sanitary and phytosanitary measures and the technical barriers to trade, as well as non-tariff measures. This is often the case in markets where we haven't exported before because of those high tariff barriers, and so we're really starting to establish that new market access. So addressing non-tariff measures related to agriculture and food exports is core business of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. We work really closely with industries and trading partners to address and resolve these and to really support the uptake of the FTA export opportunities. We also utilise the various SBS, TBT and other committees that are established through FTAs to have that ongoing negotiation with the trading partner to continue to seek to resolve and improve our market access. We certainly welcome the opportunity to provide evidence, and we're happy to take your questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And just to give us an understanding, we've got DFAT, Austrade, Department of Fisheries, Agriculture and Forestry, which is your department. Can you sort of give us, in a nutshell, your role in terms of promoting exports and if there is any contact with smaller businesses to promote or help and assist those businesses into getting into markets overseas? I know Austrade has a separate role. The Department of Foreign Affairs does the negotiations. I'd like to get a better understanding of what fisheries, agriculture and forestry's role is in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm really pleased to advise that we have a really important role, and we think a very unique role. So, as you noted, DFAT leads the negotiation of the free trade agreement. So, in effect, they unlock the door. But trade can't happen unless we actually have the technical market access, the rules of racing of how our product can meet those incoming exporter requirements. And so it's our department's role as the competent authority. We regulate agricultural food exports. We provide the systems and the support. We have the technical capability in plant and animal and food safety to actually do those technical negotiations, and we come up with those stringent conditions for both bringing food into Australia and allowing and supporting, signing off on the export of our fantastic product outside of Australia. And so we've got that twin role in terms of really enabling and unlocking trade opportunity, because we're holding the border, if you like, in terms of that competent authority role to support exports and also to control imports. In terms of how we work with industry, we don't tend to work directly with small businesses. We do work very closely with peak industry bodies, with the research and development corporations who have marketing roles, and in particular ones like Meat and Livestock Australia, who actually have a network of offices overseas. Wine Australia, again, have offices overseas. We ourselves have an Overseas Agriculture Councillor network. We have 22 positions based in 16 markets around the world supporting our agricultural trade. Mr Hughes and myself have previously taken those roles, and in those roles we're working in Australian embassies very closely with the other government. We are explaining and expanding our market access, and we're there to support Australian businesses. So when a consignment of product gets held up at the border for some reason, we'll work with our colleagues in Canberra who are doing the technical certification and work with that importing border authority to actually unlock that work. So that gives you a bit of a sense in terms of our particular technical competent authority role. And I'm pleased to advise we're very low cost, Chair. It costs about $258 million to run the export trade services and the systems that underpin $1.6 billion of trade every single week from this country. So we're at a very marginal transaction cost to government and to exporters. That's 0.031%.
Thank you. I'll go to the Deputy Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I see you guys were in the room earlier when I misdirected my question on biosecurity protocols. Just for the sake of Hansard, can the department give me an overview as to the effectiveness of biosecurity protocols and how they either work in unison or as a barrier to entry for free trade agreements?
Absolutely, Senator. And as you well know, as a mega biodiverse country, Australia has very unique we're an island. We have very unique biosecurity status, and we're very strict in terms of our rules to make sure that we remain pest and disease free as much as possible. So it is the case that we do have strict biosecurity arrangements for imported food into the country to help protect both our environment and, of course, our agricultural production, and, of course, the standards that we're able to offer our trading partners, because we are pest and disease free. A lot of our product is able to get access more easily into trading partners' markets. So that's an important part of our work, and as you would expect, a large part of our organisation is devoted to biosecurity resources and managing the border. I understand your question was about what's the balance there, because of course we do have strict controls which are important to maintain biodiversity and agricultural production, but how much does that, I guess, inhibit trading partners' access to our market? It is, of course, a balance, and the technical market access negotiation that Department of Agriculture does is something that's often happening in the sidelines of the FTA negotiations or very shortly thereafter. I think many trading partners understand that Australia's unique biodiversity status comes with it certain market access requirements. That said, we are very open to working with trading partners to put in place appropriate systems so that they can meet our appropriate level of protection. We do have an open trade stance, and we look to facilitate trade as much as possible. And of course, trade into the country is very important. A number of our own agricultural, particularly food manufacturers, are relying on that imported product to then go on and deliver fantastic product that we consume here in Australia or we then export again. So the two-way trade balance is very important. It's also important not only for our own domestic producers and jobs and production here, but equally for that win-win outcome we're seeking to achieve with trading partners.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now go to Mr. Laxton.
I'm fine, thank you, Chair. All good.
You okay?
Yep.
Senator Polly?
Yes, I was just wondering how you actually assess whether or not a free trade agreement is being as effective as what it can be. I mean, what are the indicators that you're looking at for the success of a free trade agreement?
Thank you, Senator. Look, I think it's one of those areas where we have very close collaboration with industry partners from the start of a free trade agreement, even at the point where DFAT is starting to talk about let's do a free trade agreement with this market. So throughout the course of the negotiation of the free trade agreement, we're really heavily involved. We're tapped into what stakeholders' expectations are, understanding what trade they may already be doing with the market and what gains they're hoping to see. In particular, in that technical market access area, how could we streamline some of those settings? And a good example right now is we've got a great free trade agreement with the UK, and currently our beef goes into the UK under a certain set of arrangements. We're looking to streamline those arrangements so that we have a lower cost to exporters to better access the UK market, and that's under active consideration right now. So in terms of where we hope to get to, we certainly have in confidence conversations with industry to understand what they see as the market potential and opportunity, and what settings, what sanitary settings, what certification settings are they looking for that helps them best meet those requirements at the lowest cost possible.
Can you give us an example of a free trade agreement where you've seen a major impact on our products that has turned that sector around?
Well, look, Senator, I'd actually point to our India agreement that's only recent, and the great opportunity that's come for avocados. As I'm sure you and the members of the committee are aware, we have a large agricultural production, and the avocado sector is very export focused and is looking to expand that. So we've managed as part of it, and this was a very classic example. The FTA conversation unlocked the door, and then Department of Agriculture had to do that technical market access work to actually arrange the settings so that Australian avocados could go to India. So, for instance, the agreement came into effect in December 2022, and then it was, what date was it? We then took about another year to negotiate those technical market access, and as a result, avocado exports have been going from strength to strength. So we've seen the tariff got reduced and the great growth in the first 6 months of 2024. So avocado exports to India were worth more than $2.9 million, and that's up from zero pre-technical market access. And of course, it's a huge consumer market. And even if we just are targeting a certain sliver of that high cost opportunity in the India market, we expect that to go from strength to strength.
So this free trade agreement, obviously the potential volume with India, obviously that means a lot in terms of economic benefits to the country. is there any free trade agreements at the moment where we're not doing as well in the area that you're responsible for? And I'm particularly looking at Asia and the competition we have with New Zealand for dairy products. That you can elaborate and give us some examples of where there's issues, how you go about ensuring that we get our share of that market.
Absolutely. It is the case that in some of our North Asian markets, we had some very early mover advantages in our early free trade agreements, and we've seen as those countries have done trade agreements with other nations that some of that preferential access, some of that most favoured nation status has dropped off, and so we are seeing higher competition in particular in those North Asian markets. In relation to dairy, of course, and competition with New Zealand, of course they are a very strong competitor and an incredibly strong powerhouse of dairy, and our farmers are working very hard to be as competitive as possible with our production. So in terms of, I don't have a direct example, we can certainly look for one and take that on notice to come back to you. I think we've probably got a better example in red meat.
I would actually just say that probably an example of where that sort of competitiveness comes to play, like in Korea, for instance, we negotiated our agreement quite a number of years ago. The Europeans have subsequently negotiated an improved access arrangement through their free trade agreement, and so our competitive advantage again on some dairy products in particular, but also some meat, has also diminished over that time because of we had that early mover advantage, and then subsequent agreement and negotiation has eroded some of that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have you got any other questions, Ms. Polly? Senator Polly?
No, that's fine, Chair.
Thank you.
Mindful of the time.
I call Senator Colbeck.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to go to the point where you left off with Senator Polly in relation to other nations following along and negotiating free trade agreements, which diminishes our preferential status. Don't our, and that might be right, but don't our free trade agreements include clauses that maintain at least parity with those new arrangements? So it might be that the differential between us and, say, the EU in a particular market is diminished, which brings us to a parity in sense of how much we're both paying or requiring as far as tariffs is concerned. But don't we seek to at least maintain equal status as part of our negotiations?
We do, Senator. We don't always have that outcome, and of course the EU is a particular challenge because when they go in, they also negotiate GIs, geographic indications, which means that particularly for their dairy sector, if they go in and negotiate those geographic protections, all of a sudden we're not necessarily able to send a product to that market, and so that it may not be necessarily the tariff access, that might have been the same, but the protection, and we've seen that in wine and we've seen that in dairy happen as the EU has done agreements with China, with Japan. I think they've done one with Korea. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So the negotiation of a free trade agreement by the EU with, let's use China for an example, and China's acceptance of the EU's geographic indicators means that China then won't accept a product from us that has a name that aligns with that GI.
That's right. So they'll still accept the product.
So that becomes a non-tariff trade barrier that restricts our market access.
It does. And so it doesn't mean we stop trading altogether. We can still trade that product, but we'll have to rename it. Yeah. And so that's the challenge, of course, with brand recognition, if consumers are looking for a particular name of a product.
So, for example, where Australia has led the world in the development of the Prosecco brand, for example, which is one of the more famous fights we're having with the EU over GIs, China accepting the EU's
Prosecco
GIs for Prosecco would limit our capacity to put that product into the Chinese market without calling it something different.
That's right.
Okay. Just going on to the biosecurity protocol countries, and my observation would indicate that there are more countries that are becoming more aware of biosecurity protocols and therefore becoming protocol countries that perhaps hadn't previously been. And this goes to the process that sits off the back of, we negotiate a free trade agreement, we talk about the tariffs and the price of the product going in, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee market access because you have these other protocols that need to be negotiated to gain market access.
Yeah.
Some of those can be quite expensive and intricate, and I'm thinking of Japan's probably a good one for some of the products and the biosecurity protocols that they have for our product, cherries, for example, going into that market. Is there any work being done on trying to reduce those costs which directly impact on the competitiveness of our product into the market?
Yep, Senator, that's actually a really ongoing core business for our plant and animal biosecurity colleagues who are working on the technical market access work, both to set the standards for product coming in, but also to assist our exporters to go. And so, for example, Japan, as you well know, has very strict controls, and they're, well known for going on a variety by variety basis. So instead of saying access for grapes, they then want to look at every individual variety of grapes. And so we've done quite a lot of work. And they historically limited us to 3 varieties due to those phytosanitary restrictions. Others are not as strong, but we've actually managed to negotiate that now, and we have better access to Japan for a whole range of grapes. And that's exactly the kind of ongoing work. It's fair to say there is a huge call on our biosecurity colleagues in terms of those really core technical market access skills that get us in the door. And so we have processes with industry to make sure we're prioritising appropriately. So you wouldn't be at all surprised to know we have at any one time, we probably have 100 requests on the list from countries that want to export to Australia, and equally we probably have the same number of requests on our list from our own exporters wanting to head out. We need to work on those, and we prioritise with industry, and we have a very dedicated consultation process to make sure that we bring the appropriate resources so that obviously we can get the best bang for buck.
So there's a prioritisation process on what products we would be negotiating with other countries for market access or protocol access to, that engages with industry to set the priorities within that work. I want to go back to that question I asked before about working to reduce the costs of the protocols, and we've talked about, particularly with Austrade, the modernisation process for the work, and we discussed with them, and I think you were in the room, the requirement for paper documentation and things of that nature. What's the progress in relation to that in improving the flow of information and documents, and therefore the efficiency and the cost of that process?
Senator, we've made a lot of progress. As you're no doubt aware, there's been some major investment in a digital transformation of our processes, and now we have a system called NextDoc, which is our IT system where exporters go in, fill in the relevant information to get that export certificate that's required to meet the market access requirements. We have our red meat industry, our seafood industry and dairy industry all in that new process. That significantly reduces the number of times people have to put in the same data, so it's obviously reducing error. It's reducing cost and complexity, which is a great thing. When you were talking before, Senator, you were reflecting that there are 2 sides to this story. Yeah. So the NextDoc system...
That was going to be my next question. Well, how are we going in negotiating the acceptance of XDoc with our trading partners? Because their acceptance of it is obviously critical to achieving those cost savings and benefits.
That's exactly right, and that's a clear priority as part of that work. So not all, as you well noted, not all trading partners are in a position to accept that. We did have a significant win with the EU, so we now have a business-to-business system for all of that red meat, seafood and dairy trade to the EU. So, for instance, our exporters put that information into Nextdoc, and that system talks to the EU Tracer system, and it goes all the way through, and that's gone for a paperless trade. And as you well probably recall, the EU's certificates are very complex, and they liked a hard copy with what we call a wet signature. Someone's actually physically signed that paper, which of course adds cost for exporters. So that was a great win. Not all, of course, these are IT investments. They're expensive for both sides of the transaction. So it's certainly something that we're regularly promoting in international standards, and we continue to work towards, to improve our own systems domestically so that we have least cost export certification arrangements, and then as much as possible working with trading partners to extend that e-certification process.
You talked about international standards, and Austrade mentioned the UN recognition of document standard that's being managed through the AG's department. How universally is that sort of work being accepted?
In the agriculture trade space?
Yeah. I think there's a number of streams of work that cover both the plant side of things, and so e-phyto acceptance, and that's run through a hub system for documentation exchange, which is managed through the International Plant Protection Convention, and the uptake of that globally is going very well, and a fairly strong increase in the number of markets that are assigned onto that. There's also international standards under UN CFACT, which set out some data standards around electronic certification, which covers, other sort of meat, dairy products and things like that. And we've been working with quite a wide range of countries to actually try and increase the uptake and application of those, whether it's through some of our free trade agreement implementation side of things, or on a direct bilateral basis with countries that we have a joint interest in actually moving to electronic certification with.
I mean, these systems would provide a whole range of efficiencies, and with data supply chain verification systems, probably as good, if not better, verification of documentation systems. Do other countries see the benefits in the quality of verification, but also the productivity gains that could be made and cost reductions for implementing these systems? Or is it just what are the sort of things that are holding them back from taking up the new technology?
I think it's fair to say there's strong understanding, I think, from many countries, in particular in our conversations at the WTO, of that. For many countries, of course, it's cost and complexity. They simply don't have the ability to invest in that way, and that's why e-phyto was a fantastic, centralised thing from the UN FAO and the IPPC, the International Plant Protection, because it effectively provides the IT system for any country to utilise. Other countries will have different arrangements. So, for instance, in the US, we're actually very fortunate in Australia. We have Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. We are the competent authority, and it's all united together. The US has many different agencies who actually work together collectively to promote trade. So trying to bring many agencies together united under one IT system is a very complex arrangement for them. So despite the fact that they're obviously a trade powerhouse, their own governance arrangements make it very difficult for them to do that, and a number of trading partners have similar kind of challenges.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Colbeck. I'll now go to Mr. Gillespie.
Look, everyone's asked plenty of really probing questions. I have nothing further, Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. I've just got one very more for information. In terms of ACCI, the monitoring of what comes into the country now, can you the relationship, I know they're under agriculture, fisheries and forestry, but the relationship, do you work closely together for?
Chair, that is our department, and so we are doing both export facilitation and regulation and control and import controls at the border. So, of course, we have biosecurity officers at all of the airports and the ports, and we have a whole range of technical experts, scientists, vets doing the risk assessment work to actually set the rules and the requirements for that product coming in, and we run.
That's export and import.
Yes, indeed. We do control the border.
When it comes to import, obviously there's two major checks. One is your department and the other one is customs. Are you aware of previously those checks being done in and or around the same time? And has that diverted? Has that changed?
Look, Senator, I have to admit I don't have as strong an understanding of exactly how we're operating at the border with our colleagues at Customs. I am aware, for instance, I was at Sydney Airport meeting some of my colleagues at the border and how they operated, and they were, this is obviously anecdotal, checking passengers, and they noticed a range of things, and then they...
talking more about importers of goods.
I see. Yeah. Imported goods and containers. Look, Senator, our biosecurity staff are a standalone staff, and they are operating at those ports and at the airports. So I expect that they're working in consultation with, but they're looking obviously for different things and would have different standards and protocols.
And the reason I'm asking this question is I've been approached on a number of times by different importers who are saying the times over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of having checks are blowing out. Do you have any statistics that shows the times for a check over a period of time? Do you monitor that?
Senator, I expect that actually our biosecurity colleagues would monitor that. I'll take that on notice for you and come back with some further information.
Thank you. On that point, if there's no other questions, thank you very much for appearing before the committee today. If you've been asked to provide a few additional information, just as I just asked, please send it to the Secretariat, preferably before Friday the 27th of September. You'll also be sent a transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request any corrections to the transcripts or any errors that you think that have been made. Finally, thank you very much for appearing. It's been very beneficial for us. And if we need any other information, we may call on you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Good morning.
And at that point, we now have a break till 11:20 Eastern Standard Time. That's Canberra time. So we'll see you all at 11:20. I now welcome the Department of Home Affairs. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Good morning, Chair. Tarani Vathanagay, First Assistant Secretary, Strategy and Policy in the Australian Border Force, obviously part of Department of Home Affairs.
Thank you.
Good morning, Chair.
The other two?
Good morning, Chair. Kimberly Clydesdale, Assistant Secretary for Customs Trade Policy in the Australian Border Force, part of the Department of Home Affairs.
Excellent.
Morning, Chair. Patrick Bryson, Acting Assistant Secretary, Skilled Visas Branch, Department of Home Affairs.
Good morning, and thank you for appearing before the committee today. This hearing is a legal proceeding in the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'll now invite you to make a short opening statement of no more than 5 minutes before we proceed to a discussion and a general Q&A. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I understand that the opening statement has been provided through to the Secretariat as well. The Department, including the ABF, would like to thank the committee for the opportunity to attend this hearing today. As noted in our submission to this inquiry, the ABF is involved at all stages of an FTA, or free trade agreement, from developing an initial mandate through to implementation. We also provided a submission to the committee's earlier inquiry into the government's approach to negotiating trade and investment agreements. The ABF's role is to ensure that Australian businesses can make use of Australia's FTAs, and this includes implementing the various tariff reductions, ensuring that only goods that are eligible for those reductions make use of them, and that commitments providing access to the Working Holiday Maker program occur. We are one of the few agencies required to make legislative changes to implement FTAs that are concluded. With 18 FTAs in force covering almost 75% of Australia's trade, each new agreement adds to the ongoing work of the department. This work continues beyond just the entry into force of an agreement, and at the entry into force, and I understand you've received some questions or put some questions already to this hearing today, the ABF publishes guides to assist importers in making use of the FTA. Given an FTA is a negotiated outcome, these guides are detailed and focus on the import process, and each agreement has a page on our website to assist these importers. These publicly available guides and websites support importers when they work with their suppliers by providing clear information on what the ABF requires. As noted in our submission, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade also provides guidance which includes a focus on Australian exporters. Following entry into force, the ABF supports DFAT in working with FTA partners to overcome specific issues as they occur. This can include explaining Australia's approach to the FTA partner to reach a shared understanding of how Australia implements some of the administrative aspects of an FTA. An example of this could be regarding documentation like the declaration or a certificate of origin. At other times, this could include publishing specific guidance to address concerns such as our guidance on minor errors and discrepancies, which we noted in our submission. Given the ABF's part in the ongoing implementation of FTAs, the ABF supports the updating of existing FTAs to ensure they remain relevant. The Joint Standing Committee on Treaties has recently considered amendments to the Australia-New Zealand FTA and the accession of the UK to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the CPTPP. This work on modernising existing FTAs or increasing the members will continue to support Australian businesses in the years to come, and something that my department is involved in. As part of our submission, we noted that 457 tariff lines would be set to free from 1 July 2024. This has now occurred. This outcome is important to note in this inquiry, as the lines are those that had a duty rate, generally of 5%, but for which duty was rarely paid due to a combination of FTAs, concessional rates of duty, or rates of duty that Australia unilaterally provides to least developed or developing countries. It would be fair to say that the high utilisation of the FTA outcomes for those goods, alongside other concessions, has contributed to those lines being identified. While the list of goods may appear to be disparate, this reflected that high level of utilisation and would reduce the administrative burden for importers. I recall that the ABC published an article in March when the measure was introduced titled Tampons, Toothbrushes and Toasters to have nuisance tariffs cut. Covering a total of $8.5 billion worth of imports per year, only $10 million of revenue was collected, while compliance costs to Australian businesses were estimated at 3 times that value. Some Australian businesses producing goods covered by these tariff lines were surprised to find out that they had been operating without the protection provided by tariffs and are internationally competitive. This is because they had been competing with goods that, instead of paying the 5% rate of duty, had actually been entering duty-free. We noted in the department's submission that the previous inquiry, that import clearances dataset that forms part of the Australian Bureau of Statistics International Merchandise Trade Statistics shows use of in-force FTAs. We expect that the removal of duty on these goods will have an impact on the amount of goods using an FTA for import into Australia. In other words, importers no longer need to jump through the required administrative hoops to get that free rate. This is important since a free rate of duty is being accessed, even though the trade is no longer being marked against a specific FTA. Finally, the ABF is considering how we can streamline some of the administrative requirements within the bounds of each FTA. For instance, by providing Australian trusted traders with waivers to requiring various origin documentation at importation. This supports businesses with a good compliance record by reducing some of that built-in administrative burden that comes from a negotiated outcome. We are also promoting the acceptance of digitally verifiable trade documents with partner countries, including those trials using a digital verification platform, which provides greater assurance that the document is authentic. This could support Australian exporters required to present a certificate of origin under an FTA. We're happy to answer any questions you have today, and we'll endeavour to answer them today. Where we're not able to, we will take these on notice and provide a response as soon as possible. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for your submission, and thank you for your briefing just now outlining the submissions. I'll kick off with one question and then I'll hand over to my Deputy Chair. Well, two questions actually, which group into one. Can you explain how the Australian Border Force supports Australian businesses importing goods into Australia? What measures are in place to support them and help them? I know they've got a role, of course, but the question leads on to how long does it take for the ABF to process goods coming into Australia? And I'd like specifically about perishable goods such as foods in containers that perhaps go to the warehouse and then await customs to turn up together with aquas. And do you coordinate it together, or does one turn up 3 weeks earlier and one 4 weeks later, which then extends it? And if you've got perishable goods, it creates a huge problem. And I've had some feedback from some importers on that particular issue. Whereas once upon a time, the timing would be made for when the agencies turned up, and they would turn up usually around the same day or a day apart. Whereas now that's being elongated. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. So to your first question, how do we help importers in terms of navigating the impact of an FTA? As I mentioned previously, we produce quite some detailed guides in terms of how to access the various components of an FTA, and these are available on our website. What we find, though, is that most importers really usually use brokers and agents to be able to navigate that system, and certainly our experience has been that has been quite effective. In terms of how we react at the border when the perishable goods turn up, either coming into Australia or departing Australia, and particularly in relation to perishable goods, of course, we understand what the type of good that is, and it depends in part if it comes through air cargo or sea cargo or through international mail, though that's generally less of an issue. In terms of both air and sea cargo, we attempt to intervene only where risks have been identified, and generally intervene, for example, in sea cargo at a rate of about 2%. So on the whole, our clearance rates should not prevent perishable items from being left in the side of a warehouse or on the side of a port. But I'm more than happy to take those specific clearance rates on notice, Chair, if that is useful, and provide that to you. I'm sure we've got it publicly, but we'll get that detail to you.
Thank you. That would be great. So basically, part of the question was how long does it take, on average, for the ABF to process goods coming into Australia, particularly perishable goods. Thank you. I'll hand over to the Deputy Chair. Deputy Chair.
Deputy Chair isn't present anymore, Steve. He might have.
Dr. Gillespie, then yourself.
Yeah. Oh well. Thanks very much. I was keen to hear from DFAT about the costs of exporting once we engage these FTAs. As you can appreciate, putting a biosecurity levy on all Australian producers went down like a lead balloon when most people producing food and fibre here find they're competing on a cost basis, but it opened a whole can of worms. Could you explain to us what charges there are for Australians who want to access this free trade agreement cluster? What costs do they have for us to export compared to, are you able to compare it to what other countries charge their exporters? And most people don't understand why they were going to have charges put on them, particularly if they weren't actually going to an export market. And also, how much do we get charged when we're sending stuff into countries?
Thank you, Dr Gillespie. Just to clarify, the Department of Home Affairs and the Australian Border Force principally focus on imports rather than exports. I know my colleagues from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade will be appearing after us, and they might be better placed to answer your question, but I'll just check with my team as to if we have anything that will specifically answer your question. No, I don't think we do.
Okay. Sorry, I thought it was in your bailiwick, but I'll save the question.
We'll let them know.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Gillespie. Mr. Lexley.
I'm fine, thank you, Chair. Most of my questions are sort of regarding exports rather than imports, so I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chair. I might ask a question I was anticipating. Thanks, Chair. I might ask a question I was anticipating Mr. Laxell might have asked, which is in the guides that you publish, how many different languages, or is it?
Senator, so the guides are published in English and are at this stage not translated to other languages. They are quite complex and technical in nature and don't lend themselves to an easy translation. Having said that, I understand that our colleagues in the ASEAN space do translate both agreements and other material into other languages, but from an Australian and ABF point of view, it's just published in English.
And I suppose, to go to another point that you did make in your opening statement, that most importers use a broker or an agent, that would tend to mitigate that, or you would hope that it would.
That's correct, Senator. The brokers and agents that are familiar with the Australian border use these guides and are very adept at identifying which of the mechanisms under the various FTAs would be most suitable for importers.
So in respect of the ASEAN partners or operatives in those jurisdictions that use the guides or translate them, what quality assurance systems do you have to make sure that, because they're so technical, that they're actually correctly reflecting what our requirements are?
So in terms of a degree of quality assurance over what the ASEAN work or other partners undertake, perhaps I'll answer the question this way, Senator. We don't conduct quality assurance over that material, but we obviously are the recipients of the activity when the import actually occurs. So, if you like, the quality assurance or the compliance with the components of the FTA are assured at the entry, as opposed to at the interpretation end.
Okay. Just want to go on to some of the work that you're doing around certificates of origin, and you also mentioned some of the work that's happening around digital documentation and guarantees that is what it says it is as part of the verification systems that are being developed. And particularly in respect of certificates of origin, have you done any analysis, or is there any analysis around the costs that might be attributed to businesses in ensuring or providing that information?
Just to clarify, Senator, are you speaking there about Australian businesses exporting or international businesses importing?
Well, it probably tends to merge a little bit because although there's been some change in probably the last 3 or 4 years since COVID, the trend over the last decade or so has been for much more trade to be component driven, and so a lot of businesses in Australia are part of global supply chains, for example. And I'll make up something for the sake of the conversation. Somebody might be making rear view mirrors or side mirrors for a car here in Australia that are being sent to Korea to form part of a vehicle. Yep. That's then goes into a global market. And, you know, so in an automotive trade sense, a lot of component manufacturers are now supplying into a global supply chain rather than to an Australian manufacturing sector. And so the requirement for all these costs becomes, or all of these certifications and systems becomes part of an overall cost. So my question is based on trying to minimise cost in the system. Yeah. Digitisation is a terrific tool in that sense, and efficiency and productivity gains, all of those things recognised. So I was curious as to whether there's been any assessment of that, the cost for business to do that. Looking at it in the context of trying to drive efficiency and cost gain by digitisation. So you've got an argument to make when you're talking with our trading partners. It doesn't matter whether it's coming or going, quite frankly, because it has a benefit both ways. Yep. And if some of the materials that are being used by Australian manufacturers in their componentry is being imported anyway, any cost in the supply chain is a cost in the end product.
Absolutely.
So it's probably complex, but is there any assessment of cost or assessment of cost benefit for going down the track of the new systems?
So I'll take advice from my team on this. We've certainly assessed the cost of administrative burden, the requirement for paper-based certificates of origin, and we've assessed that obviously there is a benefit both to us as the Australian government, but also to importers and exporters alike. In terms of the requirements to or the ability to verify documents, we have found that, pardon me, some of our partner countries still prefer to verify those certificates of origin with the appropriate seals and markings and so on. So that idea of being able to digitally verify them becomes really important. For Australian importers, my understanding is that the ability to make a declaration is much simpler and takes away the need to require these documents. But as to that question of have we actually calculated the cost both in time and dollars, I'll just take. We don't think we have. So, Senator, I don't know if we have actually, and I don't think we have done the analysis around the digital verification of certificates of origin. But if I've got that wrong, we'll come back to you today with a dollar figure.
So in terms of the trial work that you're doing, where's that at, and what are the next steps?
So we are conducting some incremental trials, really around that digitally verifiable certificate of origin, and giving that assurance to our partners around the authenticity of it. So the initial.
What are the key markers in that? What are the things that? What are the tools that we're using to give confidence to our partners?
That it's in fact authentic?
Yeah.
So I might have to take the sort of technical answer to that on notice, Senator. But my understanding is that it's details around issuing authority, issuing agency, relevant seals, signatures and so on. And the intent of the digital verification platform is to give the assurance to the sort of receiving agency that it is in fact a verified document, and then don't require the interaction between issuing agencies to confirm that the certificate of origin is actually accurate.
So we're using some sort of technology to
Absolutely.
verify the digital supply chain, if you like, say a blockchain type of technology that would verify the data as it moves through the system?
My understanding is that it's more around verifying the original certificate of origin to give the assurance, if you like, that check-in. We used some of this technology in the last sort of 4 years around the pandemic. You might recall of, yep, that person has the appropriate certification, vaccination, whatever it is. It's that kind of confirmation that rather than a blockchain technology that adds to the certificate of origin information.
Okay. So, sorry, back to the process that you're going through with respect to the trials.
So we're undertaking some of those trials. The initial proof of concept were conducted a couple of years ago. They were very successful. We worked with Singapore Customs and Infocom Media Development Authority and a number of industry partners on it, and we're working on that verification project and platform as we speak. So I anticipate that in the next 6 to 12 months that I'll be able to give a further update in terms of the digital verification work.
Thank you, Dr. Colbeck. Have you completed your questions?
That'll do me, thanks, Chair. Yeah.
Deputy Chair.
I'm good, Steve. Thanks, Chair.
Senator Polly is not in the room?
No.
No, okay. And Mr. Laxley?
I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. In terms of, in your submission, I noted that, and you raised it in your statement as well, that the ABF's work to support Australian importers to meet those obligations, that you work together with them. But can I ask what assistance is given in terms of Australian importers in terms of meeting their obligations? Is there educational programs? Was it just through the internet that they look up? What sort of assistance is given so they know exactly what their obligations are and what to expect when they're importing a particular good or exporting in that case?
So, thank you, Chair. The principle, so there's no specific education campaign that the Department of Home Affairs or the Australian Border Force conducts for importers as a group, but it really is through the engagement of the brokers and agents where they navigate the complexity that is the Australian border across all of the different requirements.
Okay, so in terms of your average importer, small business, where would they go? I know there's the website. Apart from the website, where else would they go for their information? If you're saying only through their agent or through their broker?
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Chair. Our experience is that a majority of importers' businesses, as opposed to individuals, do utilise brokers and agents to ensure compliance. I'm happy to take on notice what the sort of proportion of folks that try to navigate the system outside of through a broker or agent. But in terms of interaction with us, it's principally done through the integrated cargo system, which I'm sure you've heard about previously. There's sort of certification requirements to get into that system. Our experience is that it's mostly brokers and agents that navigate that system, not individual importers.
There's very few small businesses, and they would be very small businesses that operate on their own accord. Would that be correct? A correct assumption to make?
That would be my assumption too, Chair. That it's quite a small number, given all of the various requirements, as you know, to navigate trade, international trade.
Okay, so for that small group, is there anything available to them? And I suspect that small group would be businesses that are just starting on their expedition of exporting. Maybe they don't have the resources to have a broker. Is there anything for those people? Is there something that someone that's thinking of exporting, for example, or importing, can go to a website and say, I've got a jar of tomatoes that I'm importing into the country, jars in tons. What's required?
So absolutely, Chair. You've already talked about the website. There are also contact details on the website that importers could reach us through to ask the kinds of questions that they might have in mind. And you might find, though, our advice might be, depending on the size of the importer, that it might be preferable for them to get specific advice through a broker or agent. But absolutely, they can still reach us in terms of answering those questions.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from any members or senators? Being no other questions, I thank the Department of Home Affairs for appearing before us today. And thank you for coming today. Very important for us to hear directly from you. Can I just say that if you've been asked to provide any additional information, there's a couple of things there that we've asked for. Could you please send... Excuse me.
You're right. Geez, don't expire on us.
For the Secretariat by Friday the 27th of September. And you'll also be sent a transcript of today's evidence, and you'll have an opportunity to make any corrections that you feel that perhaps the transcript, if you feel the transcript has any errors in it. And again, thank you very much for appearing. If we have any further questions, we may be in touch with you again. And secondly, thank you for doing such great work on our borders, both importing and on the exporting side of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair.
Thanks. Now, I know that we're a little bit ahead of schedule as Secretariat, but is the Department of Foreign Affairs there at this point?
Yes, they are here.
Excellent.
No, they're not all quite here yet. So might just want to suspend for a few minutes.
We can suspend for within 5 minutes. They'll be there, do you think, or?
As soon as they come in, we'll make you aware, mate.
Okay, thank you. Just let us know. Yell out. Thanks.
Could you take it?
Well, good morning and welcome. Can I just start off by welcoming DFAT to give evidence today. Thank you once again for appearing before us, and thank you as well for your submission. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Ravi Kevaram. I head up the FTA and Stakeholder Engagement Division in DFAT. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Emerson-Elliott, Assistant Secretary of our FTA Implementation and Inclusive Trade Branch.
Thank you. Just before we go on to the next person, can I ask the Secretary, are the cameras on? Because we have nothing on our screens.
Yes, they should be on.
Yep, no. There's nothing, I don't know about others who are remotely in, but anyway, we'll continue with the introductions. Next.
Thank you, Chair. Simon Clayton. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Agriculture and Non-Tariff Barriers Branch at DFAT.
Thank you, Simon.
Hello, I'm Mr. Ashley Brosnan. I'm the Acting Assistant Secretary of our International Economics Branch. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Welcome and thank you for appearing before us today. For the Hansard record, we've done the introductions. We now, just a couple of things I have to read, which are formal process of this hearing. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given before the committee today, serious matter may be regarded as a contempt of the Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I'll now ask you to make a short opening statement of no more than 5 minutes, and then we'll proceed to questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, for Hansard. Again, Ravi Kevalram. We don't have a formal statement, Chair. We just wanted to acknowledge with appreciation the committee's work building on the previous inquiry, of course. As you know, for the department, the free trade agreement agenda is a very important part of the government agenda in terms of ensuring, improving, helping Australia's economic prosperity and Australia's economic security. So we are very glad to be able to appear before you to assist in your inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll change the procedure around a bit. Usually I kick off with questions, but I know that Mr. Laxall has a number of questions, so I'll ask Mr. Laxall to start.
Oh, thanks, Chair. I appreciate that. Thanks for your time here today. I guess I just wanted to understand what role you play in engaging with diaspora communities, in particular in regard to free trade agreements or just bilateral trade. We've heard a bit of evidence from Austrade earlier, but what's your role in that?
So there are a number of mechanisms that we engage with, but I might just, if I may, zoom out a little bit, which is to talk about sort of our role in FTA negotiations as such. As you would have heard from a range of other colleagues who've appeared before you as well, negotiations are a whole of government effort. So there are a number of agencies and others who participate in them. DFAT's role is one of leading the negotiations. And at the officials level, of course. And as part of that, in developing the agenda or mandate or the objectives for an FTA, through the negotiations and in the implementation of the FTA and the promotion of the FTA, we work with a range of stakeholders that includes very directly relevant chambers of commerce, for example, that are focused on the bilateral trading relationship. In fact, just recently, this week, in fact, I was briefing the Arab Australia Chamber of Commerce on progress in the FTA with the UAE. The previous week, in fact, we were engaging with a range of business organizations and community groups involved with the Australia-India bilateral relationship, and that was in the context of the FTA negotiation we have with them, with India at the moment. So it's in the actual FTA negotiations, there are a lot of interactions with diaspora communities who are often very active members of, for example, those chambers of commerce. And then following the conclusion of an FTA as well, we also then work and with Austrade and other colleagues in engaging, for example, those chambers of commerce or briefing various groupings of diaspora communities to talk about the FTA, and that might be of most interest to them and that community.
So just in terms of who you engage with, what's the process of maintaining that list of groups? Because I think from evidence we've received to date, and I know it's not, every group, but these groups change names, change leadership. Some pop up, some disappear.
Yes.
Like, talk to me about how you ensure that you're staying on top of movements in those business chambers.
So, look, thank you, and that's a really important point. And we have a couple of mechanisms by which we do this. So, what I talked about in my previous answer was very specifically about when in our engagement on specifically when we're negotiating trade agreements. But there are a range of sort of mechanisms with which the department more generally is connecting with diaspora communities, and I haven't gone into, for example, the range of councils, foundations and institutes that we help support and engage with, who also engage with diaspora communities. And a classic example, again, this is all very fresh because we've just had a negotiating round with India in Sydney this week. And, for example, the Council for Australia-India Relations, was involved in that, and we try and work through those other existing mechanisms as well. But coming back to your question, we are very careful to have a very broad and open invitation to stakeholders. So we, whether it's through business groupings that might already exist, like at the peak level, ACI business, BCA, Australian Industry Group, etc. We engage, we openly invite submissions from anybody in the Australian community who has an interest. We then, if they've identified themselves as having an interest, then through the negotiation, we would keep working with them. We get invited to brief various groupings, and then, we go along, support that, tell them what's going on, etc. So we don't sort of try and predetermine that we'll speak to this grouping or that grouping. We extend an invitation broadly, and then we follow through and engage with those who take up that invitation.
Okay. I just think there's a communication issue with, I just don't think there's a broad awareness of some of that stuff, particularly the negotiation, and that's from evidence we've received and personal discussions I've had with some of these groups. So maybe throughout this inquiry, you might be made aware of some other ways in which that can happen. So do you just do a post on your website, or do you advertise, or do you go to these established groups and rely on them to communicate? How do you communicate this out?
So there are a range of mechanisms. The website is a very key part of that, but also we have got a pretty extensive architecture in terms of stakeholder engagement, and I am broadening it out to stakeholder engagement. I'm not saying that there might not be a particular group who has an interest that we haven't got on our radar because, as you say, they haven't got, they haven't heard, etc. So yes, it does rely a lot on us using our website, but then we have very active efforts to reach individual businesses, unions, peak bodies, civil society, First Nations groups, and we do that through digital communications, including on our website the various FTA business guides, I don't know if all of you have received this, but here's the latest copy of the Business Envoy publication, which we, and in fact, entirely coincidentally, this one is on FTAs. So very keen to leave copies with all of you on that. So business comment, regular bulletins. We have an FTA portal, which is about providing very comprehensive information for exporters and importers of goods and services about how the FTA network operates. We use social media. We use subscriber mailouts. We have, of course, a range of architectural, like macro groupings, which is with the states and territories, the Ministerial Council on Trade and Investment, which is supported by Senior Officials Trades and Investment Group. We have a Trade 2040 task force, and as I say, we also work with councils, foundations, etc. We have peak bodies consultations, and we have a regional business engagement program. Now, on top of all of this, I mentioned individual businesses or individual community groups. All it needs is for us to be aware that there's a group that has an interest, and then we try and make sure that we provide all of the information, engage.
I think that's where the disconnect is. The ones that do have an interest maybe don't know where to go, and I think that's maybe where we need to go. So that was in negotiation. What does DFAT do in terms of promotion of the benefits or reaching? It seems like some of the other agencies were kind of focused on dealing with people who export already. But sort of how do you sort of do a bit more outreach, or do you do that, or is that more of an Austrade thing?
Austrade, I think I saw a summary of the Austrade evidence, and I think they made the point that they do work very closely with DFAT. So it is a joint intention. Sometimes it's literally a joint activity. Sometimes it might be Austrade colleagues, taking the lead and providing the actual briefings. But there is a lot of work that gets done in the making sure that we have got the input to do the negotiations that match, overall Australian community interest in that particular FTA. But then there is also a lot of post-FTA advocacy that is done, as I say, in partnership with Austrade. It can be in partnership also, for example, if it's agriculture sector related, then, we would be looking to work very closely with DAF colleagues and so on. So there is a focus, but this is why I said what I did about welcoming this inquiry. We're always looking for ways to make sure that we're getting to everybody, who has an interest now, as you say, current exporters, but we are also very keen to get to those who might have an interest but might not know all of these things. So, we'd be very interested in the findings from this inquiry to make sure that we continue to fine-tune what we're trying to do.
Last question. Do you do some of your publications and advocacy in languages other than English? Or you just do it in English? Like targeting or advertising emails, all that stuff?
So we I'd have to check on that with respect to the foundations and councils and so on, and how they might use some of that material. We do use, we rely on English language communications a lot.
Just for that publication, which I think is reasonable, but so Austrade advertise out, and they said they use social media and blah, blah, blah. But they don't do it to non-English platforms. Do you advertise in the same way, or when you put out consultation paper, do you advertise behind it, or you don't really do that?
Look, we do... we would advertise the call for submissions, for example.
But where do you advertise that?
It's not so much, and I'll just have to check on that. I think that we do rely on our website a lot for highlighting things and social media. So, for example, I think I have in my head, but I do want to check this. We were doing a general review into CPTPP. Sorry, that's a regional agreement, and we...
I just Googled it, just so I knew what it was.
Sorry, you just Googled CPTPP. Yeah. Oh, sorry, okay. So there was a general review, and so we, tried to push that out through social media to just highlight to people that this is there, we're inviting submissions and so on.
So again, just English language social media, just, okay. Okay. That's it. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just check from colleagues at the table if there were anything they'd like to add or correct on anything I've said? Okay. Sorry, Chair, you're on mute.
I might just flip the coin on what Mr. Laxell said and speak about the other side of it, especially with our diaspora and our migrant multicultural groups here in Australia who have some of very successful import-export businesses through their own contacts, through their own navigation through their homelands, and that's because they know them, they have contacts there, perhaps relatives that assist and help. We have some businesses that are very successful, whether there's a free trade agreement or not with certain nations in terms of what they import and of what they export to that particular nation, and are doing very well without any assistance from, because they know how to navigate the culture, the land, etc. Does anyone ever approach these particular businesses that have done it on their own and are very successful exporting business in countries where perhaps we have no free trade agreement, in terms of us getting some knowledge and learning and understanding of the of the landscape and seeing how they've become successful at a point when we are negotiating, I suppose, a free trade agreement with a country where we haven't. And what comes to mind is the latest EU negotiations. You'll find that there's many businesses here in Australia from the migrant community, whether it be the Greek community, the Italian community, Croatian, Serbian, who are exporting and importing many, many goods and have already mapped out the landscape. And really, they don't want any assistance from anyone. They're quite successful. They're doing really well. They're concentrating on what they're doing. They've built up magnificent businesses. Does any agency ever go to them in terms of perhaps picking up some knowledge or just learning the landscape of what takes place in that particular country? I know that we have embassies, etc. That
He's disappeared into the ether.
Steve, can you hear us? We've lost him. I think you got the
Got the gist?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, thank you.
Actually, before you go, can I just check? Broadcasting, did Steve drop out or did you drop him out? He dropped out on his own accord. Copy, thanks you.
Right.
So, well, I guess he'll see the Hansard of
Yeah,
the
exactly.
recording. So, look, thanks for the question.
Sorry, can you send him a text and just let him know that the dropout's at his end, please?
We are very, very keen to get exactly this sort of intel whenever we are contemplating or involved in a negotiation. And everything I highlighted in terms of the stakeholder engagement we do, the purpose is exactly to figure out what we want to target in the negotiation. And so successful exporters, having navigated barriers through are a very good source of identifying what those barriers are. And, you know, we do try and get, as I say, as much intel as we can from people who know the market, and we use our full network. So yes, embassies and high commissions, but also Australian businesses, regardless of origin, who are dealing with the market. We want to get what's in their head into our head to make sure we're targeting our positions accordingly. On the specific comments or question with respect to the EU FTA, I might throw to Mr. Clayton.
Just before you go through the context, Steve was on the record earlier on today and he mentioned two great South Australian companies. One was San Remo, which is a pasta manufacturer going into Italy, and the other one was, I didn't think he offered the name, but it was an olive oil company sending olive oil back to Greece. So whilst I don't know if they're the two specific, that'll give you some context as to what. And I think when he has spoken to those guys, they've said they've pretty well, you know, done their own thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think that's through the context of what he was asking his questions. Is anyone speaking to these guys that are sort of kicking it out of the park and understanding how they've navigated it and see if there are any learnings?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, thank you. And as I say, specifically on EU FTA, I'll throw to Mr. Clayton. But just look, it is a key source for us of knowledge. So, you know, those who are already in market, and it's not so much whether or not they are, you know, of Italian connections or not. It's just any Australian business that is dealing in a market that we are looking at, we want to know about and figure out what we can do with in terms of, as I say, creating the architecture. But the other point you make, or that the chair makes, is that is also important, is there are a lot of these relationships being built. There is a lot of trade that is happening even outside of FTAs, and there are a range of mechanisms to assist where they want the assistance to try and get into these markets as well. Mr. Clayton, sorry. Oh, sorry, Chair.
You're back. Can you hear us?
I don't know what happened. It dropped out and just couldn't log back on, but I just did.
We're just about to hear from Mr. Clayton on the response to your question.
Thank you, Chair, for your question. I think everything that Ravi just said also holds for the EU FTA negotiations and the consultations that were done as part of those negotiations. Obviously, reaching out to Australian companies, Australian businesses, working out where the interests are, where the barriers are, and what kind of things we want to seek to change is a really important part of that. I wasn't directly involved in the negotiations myself, but I do have some numbers here about the breadth and the extent of stakeholder consultations that did take place and that are taking place in relation to the EU FTA. So from the period up to the launch of negotiations until October 2023, the team conducted 1,167 consultations with external stakeholders, and on top of that we received 1,104 submissions. So it covers a very broad range of companies, a very broad range of interests. So you kind of, if you look at the time frame between mid-2018 and October 2023, that's a meeting with an external stakeholder every 1 to 2 days. That was the extent of the consultations that took place. We invite submissions, we seek comments from business groups, from individual businesses. As we've heard, we also work through our embassies, our embassy to the EU in Brussels, individual embassies also in other EU countries as well, to try and gather as much information as we can in terms of where our interests are. On the specific question of have there been consultations with companies that have been successful, I can't answer that. I don't have the detail on that, other than to say the consultations were very broad. As I said, over 1,000 have been done and would have touched on a very broad range of companies and interests going into the EU.
Righto. It looks like we've lost Steve again, so he'll have to read all that on Hansard. Dr. Gillespie had a question.
Yeah, two questions, or two streams of questions. First thing is, with free trade or preferential trade agreements, when we're exporting, mainly in the perishable goods, food, stuff that we send that needs phytosanitary checks, is there a way that you can expedite or lower the costs of that, or is that all dependent on the receiving country putting charges on us, or are we putting charges on our own exports that are either for phytosanitary that make us uncompetitive? That's the first one. Second thing is, with the recent AUKUS and the agreement of trade in certain products between UK, US and us, are we going to alert potential manufacturers to the significance of it, in that, from what I understand, we can now export a lot of our defence capability as though we're, a state somewhere in America. There's no barriers. Or if I totally misunderstood the significance of that agreement.
Thank you, Dr. Gillespie. So, on your first question, I think you've had DAF already.
They said it.
No. I think you've had them appear, right? So, just to say that how the FTAs work would be that we don't negotiate in an FTA specific quarantine sanitary, phytosanitary measures directly in an FTA, and all of the countries always reserve the right to have SPS systems and fees and charges as part of that. So your question about whether or not a fee or charge is competitive or not is sort of separate to what we're trying to negotiate in an FTA context. So I can't answer that question, simply because it's not.
No, but that's what I was trying to sort out. Where is the pain that a lot of our producers say? There was a talk of us inserting another biosecurity levy on all the primary producers, which was sort of almost like the straw that broke the camel's back, because they say they've got all these other charges, all these other things to get our goods out, and that's just another tax on us. Why don't we just pay for those sort of things out of the importers who are competing against us and have them pay the charge? So I'm just trying to figure out which lever, which gear I shift to try and help all those producers. And it sounds like you think it's mainly in the DAF bailiwick, not at the trade agreements level.
So the trade agreements wouldn't get to that that level of detail either way, like both in terms of sending or exporting. They would be like they usually trade agreements, FTAs usually say, recognize WTO rights and obligations that each party has in this space, and that's sort of like, a blessing of it, rather than, as I say, they don't get into specific, this is the quarantine measure or not. They get into sort of making sure the systems are not turned into ways of being kind of, non-tariff barriers and stuff like that. But for Australia, the management of our system is DAF, and so, I'm not trying to not answer the question, but we don't.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah. So that, and also your second question with respect to AUKUS, I would have to check in with colleagues who are very focused on AUKUS to answer that more directly. So we might take that one on notice and come back to you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Steve, you're on mute.
I'm back on through the mobile phone this time because on the computer I just keep on getting dumped for some reason. Look, I'll read the Hansard with your answer to my question. I take it Mr. Gillespie's asked the question. Deputy Chair?
I'm all good, thanks, Steve.
Yeah. All good. Anyone else have any questions, Mr. Laxley?
Senator Colbeck?
Oh, Senator Colbeck, sorry.
Thanks, Chair. Look, just a few things. We've had some data this morning around measuring and monitoring of the free trade agreements and their utilisation. Is there a cyclical process of analysing that and reporting the data, and where could we find that?
Yes, certainly happy to share that with you.
Say your name.
Hello, it's Ashley Brosnan here, Acting Assistant Secretary. Yes, we tend to, on the import side, we draw upon Australian integrated customs system data, which is provided to us by the ABS. And on an annual basis, we calculate the utilisation by country of FTAs.
Yep.
In order to measure that on the export side, we require an exchange of data from our FTA partners because we require their customs data. As you can maybe appreciate, obtaining that data, it can be variable across country depending on their sort of capacity to sort of collect and share that data in a sort of format that can be analysed by us. And so we don't have a complete collection of export data, but we're working closely with each partner. We typically arrange an exchange alongside an annual Trade and Goods Committee meeting, and we have close relationships with our counterparts in the customs and foreign affairs departments to arrange that customs data.
So is there a specific place we could go to look for the reporting on that? Is it listed in a particular place on your website that you could point us to, for example?
We do include in the DFAT annual report.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does that include breakdowns for categories such as we, Mr. Laxale, were talking about, and perhaps the level of participation for First Nations communities?
No, unfortunately, we don't have that data available to us.
Because it's reliant on data coming back from our trading partners that wouldn't necessarily contain that detail.
Yeah, certainly. And because we're drawing on customs data, we usually draw upon the export documentation or the import documentation that comes through the, and there's no sort of measure, on that documentation to sort of measure,
So those identifiers aren't?
No, they're not
captured as part of the data collection.
No, that's right.
Okay. We talked with a couple of agencies earlier about their negotiations with other trading partners and free trade agreements that they might be undertaking that then place restrictions on what we're doing. And go back to one of my favourites, a chestnut in our trade negotiations with Europe, and certain varieties of wine that might come up with respect to a GI. Do we have conversations with our trading partners? And I acknowledge that they're going to do what's in their interests in their trade negotiations with other jurisdictions. I get all that. But to maintain our access to markets. So Prosecco, for example, China accepts GIs as part of its negotiations with the EU, which then effectively blocks a market that we would have had in our trade negotiations with China. Do we try and find ways to prevent our products being limited into markets because of relationships with other that come through other bilaterals. I mean, bilaterals have become a way forward for jurisdictions to go because of the broader failure of WTO type negotiations. So, you know, global WTO negotiations of effectively ground to a halt. So to progress things, countries have gone to bilateral, or as is the TPP, for example, or CTPP +1, or whatever it's called these days, sort of regionalised multilaterals. But do we try and minimise the inhibitions on our trade through our discussions with our trading partners in the example that I've used?
Yes, so I'll throw to Mr. Clayton in a minute specifically on EU and the whole GI debate. And you're right, Senator Colbeck, you've had a long-standing interest in this issue. But look, the question you ask is actually a really important one in a very macro sense. I should say that the WTO, while the multilateral, like all-in negotiations continue to struggle, there are even there some bright spots. So, for example, there's currently a moratorium on customs duties on e-commerce, and that was something that was renewed, and it's always hard work getting it renewed, etc. But out of the meeting in the UAE, it was renewed. And similarly, there are a range of plurilateral initiatives, including recently in the digital trade space, there were a number of WTO members who agreed on a common set of text for new global rules on digital. But your point is very valid. There is a lot of activity, whether it's bilateral or regional and so on, in the FTA space, and it is something that we are very alert to. It is what drives a number of our efforts at reviewing and updating agreements, but it is also relevant to...
I was going to say mice in the ceiling, but they're a bit bigger than that, I think. They're coming down through the vents.
Well, I think they might be helping construct something up there.
Let's hope it's constructive. Because it's not helping us.
But so, for example, if you look at what we are doing with the UAE at the moment, right, we are very conscious of the other FTAs that the UAE is negotiating, including in competitor products, for example. So we want to make sure that through our FTA, we don't lose market share or lose market opportunities in some instances. So it is something that really enlivens our sort of policy approach in terms of what we're doing and so on. We've just done an ANZFTA, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA upgrade, which is currently working its way through parliamentary processes, and that is also something that the reason we do upgrades is because we look at what's happening, and then we want to keep improving and making sure that we have the best access we can. So, and then in terms of dialogue and conversations, we are doing that all the time. It's a bit tricky at times. So, for example, New Zealand's also negotiating a UAE FTA, and we try and benchmark on one level, but of course we both have very clear commercial interests that we don't want to talk about with the other, etc. So there is a little bit of just have to be careful how we do this, but we do have an interest. And then reaching back over the years on things like, for example, on GIs, we worked with the US back, it's a couple of decades ago now, where we, together brought a WTO dispute against elements of the European GI regime, etc. So there is a lot of ongoing discussion on these issues, and it is something that does drive us in looking at what, where, why, how quickly we try and do things. Mr. Clayton, if you wanted to add anything.
Thank you. Just briefly, so obviously in the EU FTA context, GIs was a big part of the discussion, is a big part of the discussion, and there were some difficult asks from the EU in there for us, everyone knows that. And of course, this is part of the ongoing discussion that we're having with the EU in terms of, when we can engage, when we do engage, finding an appropriate kind of landing space for that is in benefit of both sides. But to expand on what we've just heard, also in the non-FTA space, I mean, another area, and my branch is involved in this, is a broader kind of piece of work on non-tariff barriers. We deal with this in the WTO context, and there are several committees in the WTO in which we raise a whole range of non-tariff barriers. I'm not specifically talking about GIs in this case, but part of our approach is also obviously in the FTA space, but the multilateral WTO space. And then another part of what we do is kind of bilateral engagement through our embassies and directly to those governments in their capital cities if we have specific non-tariff barriers that have been raised with us by business in terms of access for businesses into new markets where there are some kind of barriers which are over the top and unreasonable for the purpose that they state they're there for, or if it's about trying to maintain access or seeing access kind of closing in and businesses come to us to try and get some assistance. So there is this kind of program of work that we do in this space as well.
So just off the back of that, you said we're doing an upgrade on New Zealand at the moment.
Sorry, we're doing an upgrade, or we've signed an upgrade on the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA.
Okay.
And FTA.
I was curious as to, my recollection is, and I might be wrong, happy to be told so, New Zealand have completed an agreement with the EU and accepted GIs as part of that process. Has that cost us any market access into New Zealand?
Into New Zealand?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, I'm not aware that it has, but I'll check that and come back to you.
And a final question. Part of the strategy, as I understand it, in negotiating FTAs has been to get common trade rules through as much of our trade as possible. How effective has that been? I think the TPP, for example, was talked about as that being an example of a whole range of countries where we've got a really a significantly common set of trade rules that go right through our trade with a whole range of countries, which obviously provides a productivity gain in the way that we operate. Is that a continuing part of the way that we're looking to negotiate these arrangements? You're talking about UAE and particularly with the EU as a way of providing productivity gains in the operation of trade rules more broadly, and therefore the operation of our access to those markets?
I think that's a very good question that touches on kind of the entirety of how our FTA network operates. And so I would say a couple of things. First of all, absolutely the point of those sorts of regional mega agreements, ANSFTA and CPTPP and RCEP, right, which you're very familiar with, all of those. But a key component that is of real value to that is the sense of kind of cumulative rules of origin, where you can you don't have to have the originating product all coming out of one country, but you can actually build regional supply chains.
Yep.
And so, for example, I think it's CPTPP that is there's a very good example of where a manufacturer of was it Australian cereals under the Japan-Australia FTA, or JEPA as it's known, because there were components going into that manufacture of the cereal from other countries, it wasn't qualifying. But with CPTPP, and because they were getting those components from CPTPP members, it now qualifies, right? So, to your point, it is doing exactly what it's designed to, which is, making sure that there is the most efficient use of supply chains for the broadest possible markets, if that makes sense.
So it also takes into account the trend towards multi-jurisdictional supply chains and production. Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
thanks,
absolutely, and it is very much part of the thinking, and it's not sometimes it's hard to translate some of these more technical things into what are we getting out of CPTPP or whatever, but those sorts of issues really matter to our businesses, and they make a real difference. And given you use CPTPP just as an example to read into the record, eliminates 98% of tariffs in CPTP members. That represents a combined share of 15.6% of global GDP in 2023, including the UK. Australia's goods and services trade with CPTPP members was worth $208 billion in 2023, or 30.4% of Australia's total exports. And Australia's FDI in CPTPP members was more than 1.3 trillion in 2023, which is an estimated 35% of Australia's total outward investment. So these things really matter.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks. Steve, you still online?
Yes, I'm still here. Thank you very much.
We're ready to wind it up, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Colbeck. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Again, I'm cutting in and out, I think. Excellent. Any other questions by members or senators?
No, I think we're all done, mate.
Okay, being no other questions, can I thank the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for attending today and for giving us the evidence that they have and for their submission. So thank you for coming today. Now, if you've been asked to provide additional information, please send it through to the Secretariat by Friday the 27th of September. You'll be sent a transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to any transcription errors that you may think have been made. Also, I'd like to let you know that we may approach you again, and I suspect towards the end of the hearing we may call you in once more just to round up on everything. Finally, I'd like to thank all the members and senators who came today, all the witnesses, the Secretariat, of course, for setting it all up, and Hansard for recording everything that was said and done today. And my apologies for dropping out a couple of times. It's just the technology. Normally I would be there, but I had a doctor's appointment this afternoon in Adelaide, and that's why I had to leave last night. So thank you very much. I declare the meeting closed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.